It's Nate Erskine-Smith for another Thursday night, and we're doing things a little bit differently. It's more professional, I should say. It's much more professional than our usual ramshackle Thursday night lives here on Facebook. We are starting to stream to other platforms, so we're also streaming to YouTube tonight. We'll add other platforms as we go. We're trying to add Instagram. We'll see how that goes as well, though not for tonight. And what is new? So we'll start with a few updates, of course. As always, ask questions in the chat and share if you think others might be interested in asking questions and getting them answered. And as a starting point, in terms of an update, obviously we had a take note debate earlier this week for the discovery of the remains of the 215 Indigenous children, and it was actually a really thoughtful debate in the House of Commons. Ministers spoke, the Prime Minister spoke, but leaders of the opposition spoke as well, from the Conservatives to the NDP to the Bloc and the Greens. And I had an opportunity to speak. It was quite interesting too, because there were 5-minute speeches followed by 5 minutes of question and answer. And I encourage you to check out my speech. I mean, I basically tried my best to draw the real contrast between the country that we hold up as a success as against the really shameful part of our history, and also to recognize that there's much more work to do, and to note that this is our Canada, and the question that we face really is, what are we going to do about it? And I did note that I don't think it's fair to say we need action, we don't need symbols and words, and it's only been words. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of action, and I mentioned in my speech the almost 70% of the water advisories lifted, not enough, but significant progress since 2015. I mentioned in the speech action to protect Indigenous languages, action to address child welfare, not enough. And if folks have questions about, there's a motion that we'll vote on next week on the litigation around the Human Rights Tribunal and more. So that's relevant, and I'm speaking to the minister tomorrow on that in particular, and spoke to his team earlier today. Also held up the fact that we have implemented UNDRIP through legislation. And what I didn't mention, but I wish I had, was also our criminal justice reform package in this parliament, not only as it relates to drug policy, but also as it relates to conditional sentencing, as it relates to mandatory minimum sentences, that there is a strong push towards addressing historical racial inequities in this parliament and in the last parliament. And we just need to continue that progress. And what I did highlight was we just need to be more ambitious. That I noted conversation I had with former Senator Murray Sinclair. But anyway, all that's to say, rather than reliving the speech in its entirety, I encourage you to check it out. If you have questions at all, I always ask in the chat, but if you have questions that you think of that you don't think of tonight, definitely email me. You can always reach us, info@beynate.ca. You can check out the website for what's new in terms of what we're posting at beynate.ca, of course, and obviously on social media here. And the other bigger piece of news is in relation to border reopening, insofar as I met with Congressman Brian Higgins earlier this week, and then was in touch with Wayne Easter, a colleague of mine, and we published a joint statement that really called attention to the need to have a clear border plan going forward as it relates to the Canada-US border, that we know friends, family, businesses rely upon that cross-border traffic that we haven't seen in the last year in a really serious way. And obviously we need to proceed cautiously and based on evidence and based on science. And this isn't a matter of just opening up the border and patting ourselves on the back and just saying it's completely open. No, it's going to be a phased process. But what we learned from the CDC, but in the US, but we also learned recently from an expert panel here in Canada, the expert panel on testing and screening, they gave guidance. And just take a step back, Irfan Dalla is a co-chair. He's someone I trust a great deal. He's a constituent, and he's actually my next guest on the podcast at uncommons.ca if you want to check it out. But David Naylor was also on that panel. Kieran Moore, the new chief medical officer for Ontario, and he's been the public health lead in Kingston, and they've had great success obviously in this pandemic, and many more, lots of smart people on that panel. And they basically said, they identified different classes of travelers, but they said for fully vaccinated travelers, as one example, that fully vaccinated travelers are safe and they do not need to quarantine. Well, that opens up a lot of different possibilities. That New York, for example, has an Excelsior app that basically there's proof on one's phone that one has been vaccinated. Obviously, I have not been fully vaccinated. I've got the first dose, and I have an email from the public health authority to say that I've received confirmation that I've received my first dose. Well, again, that kind of formal confirmation, that certification and proof is really important. That should allow cross-border traffic for fully vaccinated travelers. Everyone has examples. I've received many examples in my inbox from constituents who need to do business across the border or have loved ones across the border. And in my own life, I mean, I see my brother-in-law in Michigan who is fully vaccinated in the States and could very easily come, and he can't come because he can't quarantine and spend the 2 weeks and leave his family in Michigan and leave his job in Michigan. It was a matter of coming up for a weekend to Kamlaki, and he wouldn't have to quarantine, which he doesn't have to based on the evidence that we have and based on what the experts are telling us. So just as we shouldn't have shied away from public health restrictions, and we should pursue public health restrictions based on the evidence, so too we should relax those restrictions when the evidence warrants. Anyway, so that's a conversation that I have had with colleagues in Ottawa as well, and will continue to have. And lastly, the last sort of short update that I wanted to provide is in relation to, in your usual year here in Beaches East York, we send a lot of Canada flags around so people can fly them around the riding. Coleridge is a street in the riding that oftentimes is just lined with Canada flags, and they've got a lot of spirit. Obviously, the East York Canada Day Parade is not going to happen again in the same way this year. It didn't happen, of course, in the same way last year either. And so instead of Canada flags this year, we're actually going to be we're working on the delivery mechanism because it's not quite the same, but we are going to be providing free trees, basically. So they're local trees and just encouraging people to do their part, but we're going to make sure that that's available to everyone, that through our office, that will be sort of a way of celebrating celebrating Canada Day in lieu of flags, because we don't have the supply of flags this year that we have had in past years. And so right on cue, Kenneth asks, any Canada flags this year? We have a very small number of Canada flags in comparison to past years. So Kenneth, please plant a tree. I guess is the short way of saying that. And we do have a householder coming soon. A householder is basically our print product that comes in the mail. It has an update as well of what's taken place over the last few months. And I suppose the last update is the second doses are coming. That Ontario, I heard an announcement today from Minister Elliott. They're looking at maybe escalating the second dose strategy. We know that the first dose strategy has worked. It has saved many lives, and we really have to get to that second dose strategy. It's great to see 80-plus-year-olds being vaccinated with their second dose. And my grandmom actually just got her second dose today, which was very much welcome. But we need to really, I think, lean into that second dose strategy in a really serious way. With that, what do we got here, Andy? Jaslyn says, thank you for your continued support of binational families. My 2-year-old can't wait to see her dad after 430 plus days. Wow. Right. So there is a perfect example of how we need to open up that kind of safe travel, right? So again, emphasizing safety, that this isn't a matter of opening up the border all at once, but we can look at priority categories of loved ones. And Jaslyn, your case is a perfect example, but really follow the science, right? And we know, as I say, fully vaccinated travelers can travel safely, and we need to be having that conversation. And it gets complicated. I don't want to suggest it's so easy insofar as much depends upon proof of vaccination. And so because that proof resides at the state level and at the provincial level, it does require us working in partnership with provinces and different states. But you can imagine, as a starting point at least, New York, Ontario, Michigan, we should be sitting down and hammering out at a minimum. If the federal government doesn't foresee this happening soon, and doesn't foresee this happening until, say, a month from now, we should be working out ways of doing this in the short term and proving that it can be done, and then building upon best efforts through a pilot of sorts. Sarah says, border, enough is enough. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. I've spoken a little bit in the media on this. I've done a little bit of radio. I'm speaking with Bloomberg, I think, tomorrow on this. So I will continue to elevate my voice where I can on this. Ian says, hi, Nate. Hope all is well with you. With regards to the border and travel in general, do you have any info about the rollout of vaccine passports and what form they will take? The Estonian PM did an interview with the CBC today and said that they will be using QR codes. So I don't yet. I've certainly asked this question. I've been told that it's an active conversation. I've been told that different countries seem to be proceeding in slightly different ways. And so really the question is, how do we make them interoperable as much as possible? I mentioned the Excelsior app from New York. I mentioned I mean, in Ontario, we don't have sort of an app per se, but you could imagine that public health data via Ontario could certainly be shared with the federal government and be uploaded to the COVID app if we wanted to go about it that route, certainly. Or the Arrive Can app is obviously probably makes actually the most sense as far as the tool here in Canada goes. The UK has a separate application, I believe, through the NHS as well. So again, interoperability, everything depends upon interoperability. But in the US, I know there's also been pushback from some states in relation to vaccine certification. So in my conversations with my colleagues in Ottawa, I mean, Texas has pushed back. I think Florida has pushed back as well. So it's not so easy, and it's not clear that the federal government in the US is going to have a vaccine certification plan because of pushback from certain states. So it's not the easiest path forward, but certainly there are already systems of proof, and then it's just a question of, can we rely upon those systems of proof? And so I don't know, but these are active conversations, and we really need to make sure we have them in earnest. Chelsea says, thanks for encouraging the decision makers in Ottawa. Thanks, Chelsea. I appreciate it. Ainsley says, thanks for the pop-up clinic at the Q skating rink on Sunday. I was first in line and happy to have the first shot. That is great, Ainsley. I'm very glad to hear it, and so glad to see just the number of people out there getting vaccinated. That we are. So the other update I should have mentioned, by the way, is I gave a statement in the House of Commons recognizing the efforts of frontline healthcare professionals and volunteers, and there are so many of both. So many healthcare professionals who have stood up and worked really endless hours, right, focused on helping others get their shot. But there are also so many volunteers who have stepped up as well. And, I said everyone needs to do their part. Obviously, for most of us, that just means getting your shot. But for healthcare professionals and for volunteers, that has meant really, an endless amount of time devoted to helping others. And I highlighted in particular the East Toronto Health Partners, because through their efforts, we have seen so many people here in the East End become vaccinated. Those pop-up clinics have really got into areas. It was great to see it at Q. It's been amazing to see them get into areas that otherwise have been, I think, underserved ultimately in many different ways. And then really great to see them partner with schools. And so really getting to as many people and using existing networks of community to get to as many people as possible. There's been great recognition too. George Vlahos, the Secord principal, was recognized in the Globe and Mail. So that was quite nice. But and he's a great guy, and the recognition is well deserved. But the East Toronto Health Partners have done an incredible job with pop-ups. And then I also highlighted their 10,000 day. I mean, when I got my first dose, it was at Thorncliffe when they did 10,470 doses, I think it was, in a single day, which set a national record for vaccinations within a 24-hour period. So, I mean, it's obviously really positive news seeing everyone get their shot. We just need to keep encouraging everyone to do so, and really lean on our personal relationships as much as possible, our friends, our family, our loved ones, to tell them we really need everyone to step up and participate. Jake says vaccine passports is a bad idea. Jake, respectfully, I mean, vaccines are the way outside of this, and we absolutely need to ensure that we need to make sure that people is able to have safely, and we need to make sure that we are keeping our citizens safe. And so we need to make sure that there continue to be strict border rules as far as it goes. I spoke to Kelly Lee recently for the podcast. She's a travel expert and pandemic and borders project is what she manages. She's at Simon Fraser University, and she spoke about vaccine escape and the concern about variants of concern. Well, the idea, certainly in her view, but I think experts would certainly agree that we need to, on the one hand, have a clear path for travel for people who have immunity, not just vaccinated, but those who have had COVID previously as well, that where there's proof of immunity, that there's safety in travel. without quarantine, I should say. And then we have clear and strict travel rules as it relates to testing and quarantine for others. And if you don't have that proof of immunity, then you're going to have to be tested and quarantined. So you're going to still be able to travel when we open travel up, but you're not going to be able to travel without quarantine until we're absolutely certain that vaccine escape and variants of concern don't continue to pose a risk to us. Because can you imagine, this is what Kelly said to me, can you imagine going through all of the effort that we're currently going through only to have to do it all over again because there's been a variant that has escaped the vaccines? What a nightmare that would be. Kenneth says, thanks, we had a tree planted a few years ago and it's taken over our front yard. Any Canada Day masks? It's funny you say it. That would have actually been great. I have one Canada Day mask, but I do have a few East York masks. So if you're in the market for an East York mask, Kenneth, I'm happy to send you one. Dan says, any plans for the government to follow up with further archaeological inquiries around residential schools? What about clean water for reservations still lacking? So thanks, Dan, for the questions. Twofold. One, I wasn't the only one calling for this. So many have called for the very same thing, to say we need a full investigation. There needs to be support for a full investigation across all sites and then proper accountability. And that's unquestionably true. We absolutely need that. I called for the same speech earlier week. Now, that work is underway insofar as there is a partnership with the National Center on Reconciliation to pursue this kind of work. And then there's also funding in budget 2019, almost $34 million to begin this work. But we're at the beginning of the process, I think is fair to say. And where additional funds are required, I have no doubt based on recent conversations in Ottawa, that money is not the object here. Where money is required, the federal government will be there to support. And obviously, we have to work with Indigenous communities and organizations that take the leadership in these kinds of investigations. So that's number one. Second, on clean water, I mentioned we've lifted almost 70% of long-term advisories. That's important. We've lifted dozens of short-term advisories too, to ensure that they don't become long-term advisories. It's of course unacceptable for any community to be under a long-term advisory in Canada in the year 2021. So that point is well taken, and I know many of us, not just me, but I know the Minister Miller feels the same way. There are water projects underway in every community that needs one, and what I plan to do in the next mailer that we send out, we're going to include a pie chart that basically sets out the 67 point, I forget what percent of advisories that have been lifted, but the 27 or so percent of projects that are underway in a really serious way, and then what else is left in terms of the early work that is underway in some of the other communities. So there is, and then there was a really serious financial commitment in the fall economic statement to say, when money is required, money will be provided, and we want to make sure we're not only lifting these advisories, but we're putting them on stable, firm footings going forward to make sure that the advisories don't happen again. And so that is actually an area where there's been a lot of work, a lot of meaningful progress, and I'm confident that we'll continue to see really serious progress going forward. And I should add, Mark Miller, I'm speaking to him tomorrow just on the motion before the House today that we'll vote on sometime next week. But I think he's joining me on 10th for the podcast, and I'm certainly going to put some of these questions to him. So if you have questions, if anyone has questions for Minister Miller, send them my way for the podcast, and I'll compile them, and I'll make sure I work in as many as I can. Tracy says, I was wondering, with the 215 young children lives found at the Indigenous residential school, is the Liberal government set to check out all schools? So Tracy, I just answered that in relation to Dan's question. And you're right, though. I mean, June is Indigenous History Month, and I should have added that. Thanks for the reminder, Tracy, because we've expedited a couple of other pieces of legislation. I mentioned UNDRIP, but we've also expedited C5, which establishes a national day for truth and reconciliation for September 30th. So that is, again, it's not going to solve everything, but an important step and part of the calls to action. And also C8, which amends the citizenship oath to respond to TRC call to action 94. So there's there's some small work like that underway, small but significant nonetheless underway. And then there's the really big picture pieces of the clean water that Dan was asking about. Child welfare is an area that I identified in the Q&A portion of my speech earlier this week, where we really need to double down on efforts on that front to ensure that no kid is left behind, and that we are addressing the fact that 50% of kids in foster care in this country are Indigenous, and that's an unacceptable number. And I also highlighted the need to address better support and increase support for urban Indigenous communities. And I just sent a note to Lindsay, who heads up TASK, the coalition here in Toronto that supports urban Indigenous population in Toronto. And there's $150 million coming in federal funds to support Indigenous organizations or organizations that support urban Indigenous populations. So there is work underway, but really, when so many Indigenous people here in Canada live in urban areas now, much more needs to be done, I think, to address that fact. And there are wonderful organizations that are out there doing the work. We just have to make sure they're properly resourced. Lloyd, great question. I just answered in relation to Dan about clean water. So I encourage you, actually, Andy will share in the chat the link to the update, and there you can see a couple of infographics that provide updates. There's more detail as well, and we'll be, as I say, it's a question I'll ask Mark Miller on the podcast and see how he responds, and we'll go back and forth a bit. But Tracy, you're right. Clean drinking water for everyone is the absolute least. I think there's no debating that one. And yes, Dan, many promises have been made already. That's unquestionably true. I would say it's also, though, I think fair to say that one doesn't simply, there's no quick path in some cases from the promise to the fulfilled promise, right? So in relation to clean water, if it were easy, then they would all have been lifted. But it's not I remember when Jane Philpott was the minister and the PBO had released a report to say more money is going to be required. And I said, well, look, the independent parliamentary budget officer is telling us more money is going to be required. Where's the money? And then Minister Philpott was very clear. The Prime Minister in absolute terms had said, when money is needed, money will be provided. And we've seen renewed dollars in subsequent budgets to provide greater support to end the water advisory crisis. And so if it were easy, they would all be lifted already. But at the same time, I do take heed of Senator Sinclair's words when I had him on the podcast for a conversation. He pointed to the scale of effort to respond to the COVID crisis. And so we haven't seen the same per capita response in any significant way to respond to the crisis and injustice of the treatment of Indigenous people in our history and the subsequent intergenerational trauma and the crisis that we see in many ways, the clean water being one of them, but the foster care and child welfare situation being another. So, and I think that's fair too. So point taken, definitely hold our feet to the fire, definitely criticize the government where it falls short. And of course, I mean, my role, frankly, in my position as a member of parliament is to ask tough questions of the government as well. So you're asking me those tough questions or providing me those questions is certainly helpful in terms of doing the job. Tracy says, are we any closer to the feds taking over provincial disability? I'm tired of living on $77 a month for food. I never asked to be disabled. Tracy, I don't think we are closer to the feds taking over disability. I don't have a ready update in terms of where the exact conversation is at in Minister Qualtrow's office for the disability benefit, but let me follow up on that and let me have a fuller update for you when we come back, either 2 weeks from now, or if you want to email me, I can get back to you there. Nath says, how can you work across party lines in order to push for animal rights? And how is your caucus ready to bring this issue forward? So a couple of different things. I think in the last parliament, we saw an example of working across party lines where if you look at the bill I introduced and then a bill that Michelle Rempel introduced, we ultimately saw the Justice Minister of the day, Jody Wilson-Raybould at the time, introduce government legislation that was built on my legislation and Michelle Rempel's legislation to different degrees. And so there was that kind of cross-party push that helped to make that happen. So it has happened before. And certainly we saw with the prohibition on the shark fin trade. I worked very closely with Finn Donnelly of the NDP and worked with Elizabeth May. And then when we saw the bill to prohibit the captivity of cetaceans, it was originally a Liberal senator that introduced it, Willie Moore, and then obviously Murray Sinclair picked it up when Willie Moore departed from the Senate, and then Elizabeth May brought it to the House, and I seconded it. And so there has been a lot of cross-party collaboration, and that's really the way we're going to see success. So in the last Parliament, we had a Liberal Animal Welfare Caucus. I think next week we'll be meeting as an all-party animal welfare caucus. There are priority areas that we've already discussed as a caucus in terms of the live export of horses for slaughter and the campaign that the Canadian Horse Defence Coalition and Jen Arden have brought to bear and have really raised their voices. I'm going to be talking about, I've got a list of different agenda items for next week, from including animal testing, including fur farming and more. But we're really next week going to be establishing priorities and to say what's important for, me, my parliamentary colleagues from the Liberal Party, what's important for other colleagues as well, and what can we accomplish together, and where are areas that we can work together. And the other area I'd say where there, I think, will be a lot of cross-party consensus is taking action on the commercial wildlife trade, to curb it, because we know the evidence is overwhelming, and experts have made this abundantly clear that zoonoses represent incredible risk, and that we need to take action to reduce pandemic risk. And that comes down to our food systems, and that comes down to intensive agriculture, which can be a much harder conversation. It comes down to tackling climate change, which we increasingly are doing, and again, an area where we've made meaningful progress, but we need to do more. But we also do address this idea of a One Health approach and the interconnectedness between animal health, human health, and environmental health. And that includes curbing the commercial wildlife trade. And we need to work across party lines to do that. And so I'm reasonably confident on that, particularly that latter issue. There's opportunity to work across party lines. Andy says, Andy's got a question here. What about Israel and Palestine? Again, recent podcast, I hosted John Allen, former ambassador to Israel, and we spoke about the recent violence. We spoke about the potential path forward for peace, the need to address the illegal occupation and expansion of settlements, and the need to address the evictions. We also spoke about the need to address the lack of elections in the Palestinian Authority and to limit the violent role that Hamas plays. There are any number of issues that need to be addressed in the course of that conflict. We see recently $25 million from the federal government to support humanitarian efforts, to support urgent assistance, to build up organizations, and to deliver immediate need on the ground, food and other really immediate needs for people who have been affected. And then $5 million for peace building initiatives. So that's I think a significant step forward for the Canadian government to put money on the table. We also, though, need to continue to play a role in a multilateral way, because based on my conversation with John Allen and others, Canada doesn't have the largest role to play. Obviously, we don't have the relationships in the region, and we just aren't in a position, whether as the United States is obviously with Israel, or as Egypt is potentially in relation to the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. We don't have the same relationship. So we need to work with our multilateral partners. We need to work with the EU, with the US, and more to play a significant role. For my part, I met with the Palestinian representative in Canada. I met with the representative from Israel in Canada. I have spoken to colleagues on this I've spoken to Minister Garneau about this. I've spoken certainly with others. So I've tried to raise my voice at all times. I've spoken to media about this as well. And so trying to do my part in some small way, and we'll continue to try to do so. But I encourage you, if you're interested, check out the podcast with John Allen. He is a much more articulated and informed person than I am on this issue, but I took a lot of cues from him, and it was a really interesting conversation for me. And the last thing I should say on that is also check out the May 16th statement from, I think it was Garneau posted it. It might have been that Bob Ray delivered it, but the statements have also been much clearer terms, because from my perspective, and I said this in the media to the CDC, that we need to make sure that we are vocally consistent with our longstanding foreign policy, and that is being a partner with Israel in many ways, but making sure we are standing against the expansion of settlements and making sure we are criticizing the occupation. And Matt says, many times I've contacted regarding OSAP issues. So OSAP is not an area of federal concern. So we'll make sure you are directed to the appropriate support, and whether it is our local MPP, REMA, or whether it is an agency that you ought to be in touch with in terms of getting support there. If there's a federal portion of a loan that you need addressed, we could potentially get you in touch with the right people at our level as well, and play a role as a constituency support. And so just take a step back. For constituency matters, definitely info@beynate.ca. If it's a federal matter, then we are able to help directly, obviously, as much as we reasonably can. But if it's not a federal matter, if it's a provincial matter like OSAP, then we will be making sure you are connected with others, or encouraging you to get in touch with others and providing you that contact information. And if you've got a specific case file, the best thing to do is to email. And says, is there the possibility of ever making Indigenous languages official languages of Canada alongside English and French? Yeah, you say if only symbolically, because I think there are obviously challenges to what do we mean by making an official language, in the sense of, are we requiring that there be services in those languages? There are some practical challenges potentially to this, but I know that the ITK was really pushing for this kind of idea back when we had a bill on Indigenous languages in the last Parliament, and there was a debate at the time about how this practically was a challenge. But I would also say, as you say, even symbolically, there may be ways of doing so to lift it up in a way to say, where there is if it's as simple as where there is a significant population, then they are entitled to service in that. And I mean, there's certain value in that, and there's a certain practical implementation of that if that's the idea. So there, I know Sean in reply says there are too many dialects, and expecting all civil services to be able to communicate. I mean, obviously that's impossible, but where a particular region is predominantly speaking in a particular language, then, or a particular community speaking a particular language, it may be possible. Brian says, I've been trying for months to get an answer from Minister Qualtrough about an onerous provision of the EI Act. Can you follow up for me, please? And Brian, yeah, here's a good example, actually, where if it's not an individual case file, but it's a question that you have or an issue you want to get answered as a matter of policy, certainly, yes, work through our office and we'll try and get an answer from the minister's team. Susan, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. And with that, I think I will log off. I've got a completely different setup tonight, so I don't know if it's better or worse. I don't know if it sounds better or worse, but I've got a proper microphone. I got a proper camera. I'm on a laptop, not just set up on my phone. So I hope this worked. I hope it worked out well, and we'll see you all a couple weeks from now.